The icy winds of a St. Petersburg winter swept through the streets of the city in early 1914, carrying with them a sense of foreboding that seemed to seep into the very stones of the buildings. Lamps flickered along the embankments of the Neva River, casting long, wavering shadows on the snow-covered pavements, and the chill in the air seemed to echo a tension that no citizen could name but all instinctively felt. In a small, dimly lit drawing room of an upper-class residence, a young woman named Elizaveta sat quietly, her posture calm, almost statuesque, yet her presence radiated an intensity that drew every eye in the room. Guests had arrived that evening with curiosity and expectation, unaware that what they were about to witness would unsettle them in ways that would linger far beyond the confines of polite society. It began subtly, with a soft, almost imperceptible shiver that passed through her as she gazed at each person in turn. She did not speak at first, but her eyes, large and unervingly perceptive, seemed to pierce through the veneer of civility, settling on details of dress, posture, and demeanor that would otherwise have gone unnoticed. Slowly, she began to speak, offering observations that initially seemed trivial, a faint scar here, a nervous habit there. Yet as her words accumulated, the gathering became charged with an uneasy energy. When she began to recount intimate details about strangers, facts that no one in the room could have known, there was a collective intake of breath, a shift from polite attention to astonished tension. Guests exchanged glances, some eager to believe, others clinging to skepticism, yet all aware that what they were witnessing defied ordinary explanation. Her method appeared effortless, as if knowledge flowed from her with the ease of breathing. Names, family histories, and private events emerged in her speech, each revelation precise and verifiable, leaving listeners stunned. One guest, a visiting merchant, trembled as she described a loss he had kept secret for years, a matter so private that he had never discussed it with anyone outside his immediate household. Another, a socialite known for her discretion, was unsettled when Elizaveta recounted an incident involving a recent duel among acquaintances, details of which had not been publicly disclosed. These insights were not vague generalities, they were specific, often intimate, and strikingly accurate, leaving those present with a mixture of awe and discomfort. The initial astonishment gave way to a deeper, more insidious unease as Elizaveta began to describe events that had not yet occurred. She spoke of minor accidents, personal encounters, and social developments that would unfold in the coming weeks with startling fidelity. Guests who had entered the room with curiosity now felt an almost tangible tension, a sense that their private worlds had been touched by a force beyond their comprehension. Whispers circulated among the attentive listeners, blending disbelief with a subtle fear. How could a young woman possess knowledge that extended beyond ordinary perception? Could it be chance, deduction, or some artful manipulation? Or was there something genuinely extraordinary at play, something that transcended reason and intuition alike? The atmosphere in the room thickened with psychological intensity. Those who had come expecting entertainment or polite diversion now found themselves confronting the uncanny. Some felt an involuntary shiver run down their spines as they considered the implications of her revelations, others attempted to maintain composure, masking fear and astonishment behind polite applause or nervous laughter. Even the most skeptical members of the audience could not dismiss the precise veracity of her statements. It was as though she had tapped into a hidden layer of reality, one in which the past, present, and future existed in a seamless continuum that only she could perceive and articulate. Her ability to observe without observation, to perceive without inquiry, created a tension that was both fascinating and disconcerting. Patrons quickly realized that any interaction with her carried risk. A glance, a casual remark, or even a fleeting thought could become material for her insight. The very act of being present in her gaze made one vulnerable to disclosure, a vulnerability that was simultaneously alluring and terrifying. The social fabric of the evening shifted. What had begun as a gathering of polite conversation became a silent theater of anticipation and unease. Each revelation was like a pebble dropped into a still pond, sending ripples of tension and reflection through the minds of those present. Elizaveta's own composure remained striking amid the charged atmosphere. She spoke with a calm, measured voice, never raising it in anger or excitement, yet each word carried a weight that resonated far beyond its immediate content. It was clear that she understood the power she wielded, yet she neither flaunted it nor manipulated her audience for entertainment. Instead, she maintained an eerie neutrality, allowing the truth of her observations to speak for itself. This detachment only intensified the effect, creating a sense of authority and inevitability in her revelations that left listeners both fascinated and profoundly unsettled. The psychological impact extended beyond mere astonishment. Guests reported lingering feelings of disquiet long after they departed, as if her words had left invisible traces in their consciousness. Some described dreams in which the events she had foretold unfolded in vivid detail, reinforcing the accuracy and inescapability of her insights. Others found themselves reconsidering personal relationships and decisions, haunted by the awareness that Elizaveta had perceived aspects of their lives that they had thought safely private. Her presence catalyzed a subtle, pervasive anxiety, transforming curiosity into a mixture of reverence and fear. Even among the city's elite, who were accustomed to intrigue, scandal, and unusual talents, her abilities stood apart. Patrons accustomed to clever conversation, refined social games, and discreet information gathering were confronted with a phenomenon that rendered all ordinary skill irrelevant. The rules of social engagement were rewritten in her presence. Observation alone could not prepare one for the revelations she might offer. Every interaction was a negotiation, every glance a potential disclosure, and the ordinary confidence of social performance was rendered fragile in the face of her insight. In that first evening, the foundation for her legend was laid. Witnesses departed with their impressions indelibly marked, carrying stories that would be retold, analyzed, and expanded. Letters circulated describing her calm presence, the specificity of her insights, and the unsettling sense that the future itself had been glimpsed. Each retelling added a layer of mystique, reinforcing the impression that Elizaveta was not merely a clever or observant young woman but a figure who occupied a liminal space between the known and the inexplicable, a bridge between ordinary perception and extraordinary insight. By the end of the night, the chill of winter and the quiet of the city streets contrasted sharply with the intensity of what had transpired indoors. Guests returned to their homes carrying more than anecdotes, they carried a subtle, pervasive sense of unease, a realization that they had witnessed something that could not be fully explained, reasoned away, or contained within the ordinary bounds of understanding. It was the beginning of a story that would ripple outward through St. Petersburg, touching families, clergy, scientists, and artists alike, establishing Elizaveta as a figure whose presence, insights, and moral weight would shape conversations, reflections, and anxieties for years to come. Her life, from that point forward, would be defined by the interplay of fascination, fear, ethical responsibility, and the relentless scrutiny that accompanies the extraordinary. St. Petersburg in 1914 was a city teetering on the edge of transformation, a sprawling metropolis caught between grandeur and decay, wealth and desperate poverty, tradition and modernity. Its streets, wide and cobblestoned in some quarters, narrow and winding in others, were filled with the constant clatter of horse-drawn carriages, the occasional tram, and the steady, purposeful footfalls of its citizens. Ornate buildings, gilded and imposing, stood beside crumbling tenements, reflecting both the pride and neglect of an empire that seemed at once magnificent and fragile. The air carried a mixture of scents, coal smoke from factories, the dampness of the Neva River, and the faint, lingering aroma of baked bread from street vendors. It was a city alive with contrasts, where elegance and despair coexisted in uneasy proximity. The social structure of St. Petersburg mirrored the tensions of the era. Aristocrats and wealthy merchants frequented salons, theaters, and operas, eager to maintain appearances and cultivate cultural sophistication. Their lives were insulated, cushioned by privilege, yet punctuated by anxieties about political unrest, economic instability, and the looming shadow of a Europe at war. Meanwhile, laborers, artisans, and the impoverished navigated a vastly different reality, struggling to survive amid harsh working conditions, rising prices, and limited opportunities. The contrast between these worlds was stark, yet in this tension lay the fertile ground for stories of the uncanny, the mysterious, and the unexplained. Within this landscape, a fascination with mysticism, the occult, and spiritualism thrived, particularly among the upper classes. Society's elite sought escape from the rigidity of rationalism, turning to fortune-tellers, mediums, and esoteric societies for glimpses beyond the material world. Spiritual salons were common, places where candlelight flickered over crystal balls, tarot cards, and whispered incantations. This cultural openness to the supernatural created an environment where someone like Elizaveta could emerge, attracting attention not merely as a curiosity, but as a figure of genuine intrigue and apprehension. Her abilities intersected with the city's appetite for wonder, fear, and the forbidden, ensuring that news of her gift spread quickly through the channels of social influence. The political climate added another layer of unease. St. Petersburg was the heart of the Russian Empire, a city steeped in tradition yet grappling with modern pressures. The monarchy, led by Tsar Nicholas II, faced mounting criticism and unrest. Revolutionary sentiment simmered quietly in working-class districts, whispered in factories and crowded tenements, while the aristocracy worried about the stability of their privileges. This tension imbued daily life with an undercurrent of anxiety, making the populace both more susceptible to the allure of extraordinary phenomena and more wary of disruptions to their understanding of the natural order. Elizaveta's gift, therefore, emerged at a moment when both society and individuals were sensitive to disturbances that challenged their perception of reality. The architecture and cultural backdrop of the city amplified the eeriness surrounding her story. Grand theaters and ornate ballrooms, adorned with frescoes and gilded moldings, contrasted sharply with narrow alleys where shadows clung to peeling brick walls. The Neva River sliced through the city, its dark waters reflecting the flickering lamplight of embankments and bridges, a silent witness to countless secrets and whispered fears. Winter fog often hung low, wrapping the streets in mist and obscuring the familiar, fostering an environment where imagination and superstition could thrive. In these conditions, even ordinary events could take on a spectral quality, and the arrival of someone claiming insight into the future seemed simultaneously plausible and terrifying. Social gatherings were particularly significant in this context. Salons were not just venues for entertainment, they were stages for performance, influence, and intellectual exchange. Conversations in these spaces ranged from literature and politics to philosophy, science, and the metaphysical. Within this setting, Elizaveta's abilities were not merely a novelty, they challenged deeply held beliefs about knowledge, destiny, and human understanding. Her presence disrupted the delicate balance between rationality and curiosity, creating subtle tensions that both fascinated and unsettled those around her. Observers struggled to reconcile their desire for entertainment with a creeping fear of truths they had not invited into their lives. Science and reason were ascendant in St. Petersburg, yet they coexisted uneasily with folklore and superstition. Academics and medical professionals prided themselves on observation and evidence, yet many entertained private doubts or curiosities about phenomena that defied explanation. This duality created an intellectual tension, one in which Elizaveta's demonstrations could not be easily dismissed, yet could not be wholly accepted without undermining the confidence of the rational mind. The narrative environment she entered was, therefore, layered with competing forces, belief and skepticism, tradition and innovation, fear and fascination, all converging in a city that felt simultaneously alive and on the verge of collapse. Every detail of the city's daily rhythm contributed to the atmosphere of suspense that would envelop Elizaveta's story. The ringing of church bells, the distant clatter of carriage wheels on cobblestones, and the low hum of conversation in cafes and salons created a soundscape that blended the ordinary with the ominous. Streetlights cast uneven pools of illumination, producing shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The fog that crept through the streets after dusk lent a dreamlike quality to the cityscape, making even familiar routes feel alien and potentially threatening. In such an environment, the notion of a medium capable of glimpsing the lives of strangers was not simply an entertainment, it was a disruption to the fabric of perceived reality. Within this historical and social framework, Elizaveta's emergence felt inevitable, almost fated. The elite craved mystery, the general populace sought wonder, and the tension of an uncertain future primed the city to receive someone who could blur the lines between the known and the unknown. Her abilities were not merely a personal anomaly but a reflection of the collective psyche of St. Petersburg itself, a city poised between light and shadow, rationality and superstition, history and the unfolding unknown. This was a place where her story could unfold in full, dramatic intensity, and where every reaction, from awe to fear, was heightened by the intricate social and cultural context that surrounded her. Elizaveta's early manifestations were subtle, almost imperceptible at first, leaving her family and close acquaintances uncertain whether they were witnessing something extraordinary or merely the fanciful imaginings of a highly perceptive young woman. Even as a child, she displayed an uncanny awareness of people and events beyond her immediate perception. She could recall with precise detail conversations she had never overheard, describe objects in rooms she had never visited, and sometimes speak of future events with a certainty that startled those around her. At first, these incidents were brushed off as coincidence or sharp observation. A visitor would arrive, and she would remark on a lost item or an impending errand before the visitor even spoke, leaving adults to exchange bemused glances, attributing her knowledge to intuition rather than any supernatural gift. As she grew, the accuracy of her statements became increasingly difficult to dismiss. She began to recount private matters with striking specificity. Friends would confide small secrets, only to find her preemptively speaking of them before they could voice a word. Letters, illnesses, and events in the lives of relatives far removed from her daily life were recalled with precise clarity. The family, initially charmed and even proud, soon found themselves unsettled. Her mother, once indulgent and amused, began to worry about the implications of such knowledge. How could a young girl possess insights so precise, so intimate, into lives she had never touched? Her father, a man of rational mind and scientific bent, attempted to find explanations in observation, deduction, and memory, yet even he could not account for the increasing frequency and accuracy of her revelations. Some incidents verged on the eerie. During quiet afternoons in the family's drawing room, Elizaveta would suddenly announce events that had not yet happened, predicting the arrival of guests or the outcome of minor disputes before anyone else knew. Visitors and servants alike noted that she would sometimes mutter names in sleep or during idle moments, only for those very individuals to appear later with circumstances she had described accurately. Objects would occasionally be found exactly where she had said they would be, despite her never having touched or arranged them. These anomalies, while small, created a growing tension in her household. Simple disbelief no longer sufficed, a creeping unease began to pervade daily life, as though the boundary between ordinary reality and something inexplicably other had thinned around her presence. Her school years only intensified the mystery. Teachers began to notice her exceptional memory and her ability to recall facts and events without prior study or prompting. When classmates attempted to conceal misdeeds or secrets, she often revealed them with a disconcerting precision. This earned her both admiration and apprehension among peers. She was regarded as brilliant, strange, and at times frightening. While many sought her company, others avoided her, whispering about her uncanny insights and apparent connection to events beyond the ordinary. The social dynamics of her school mirrored the broader tension that would later define her public life: curiosity mixed with fear, fascination tempered by suspicion. The family attempted, in small ways, to normalize her experiences, encouraging her to engage in ordinary activities and suppress attention to her peculiar abilities. Yet the very effort to control or explain her gift seemed to intensify it. Dreams and visions began to surface, showing scenes of people she had never met, places she had never visited, and moments yet to occur. These were not fleeting images but detailed recollections, vivid in color, sound, and motion, leaving her both amazed and exhausted. As she matured, these experiences took on an emotional weight. She began to feel a strange responsibility, a compulsion to recount what she saw and understood, even when it brought discomfort or distress to those around her. Observers outside the family circle soon became involved. Neighbors and acquaintances, initially amused, began to report incidents in which Elizaveta predicted events with startling accuracy. A shipment of goods arriving early, a sudden illness, or the outcome of minor disputes, all were foretold with specificity. Word spread slowly at first, as the family attempted to manage attention, but the subtle anomalies became increasingly difficult to ignore. Local gossips, intrigued by the combination of her youth, charm, and unsettling knowledge, began to recount tales of her premonitions and insights, often embellishing details, further heightening the mystique surrounding her presence. Psychologically, these early experiences shaped her profoundly. Elizaveta developed a cautious awareness of the impact her words could have, learning to navigate a delicate balance between revealing and withholding information. At times, she experienced deep anxiety, sensing the weight of knowledge that belonged to others, feeling the moral and emotional responsibility of speaking truths that were not hers to disclose. She also began to understand the social consequences of her abilities. Admiration could turn to fear, fascination into suspicion, and the smallest revelation could shift relationships and provoke unease. By the time she reached young adulthood, the early signs of her gift had coalesced into a discernible pattern, one that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or childish intuition. Private conversations, daily routines, and casual interactions increasingly became the stage for her insights, each demonstration building upon the last, leaving family, friends, and eventual witnesses with a growing sense of awe, unease, and inescapable curiosity. The narrative of her life was no longer simply a domestic curiosity, it was becoming a story that demanded attention, a story that would soon expand beyond the confines of her household and into the salons and streets of St. Petersburg itself. Elizaveta's abilities, once contained within the walls of her family home, began to spill into the wider social world, capturing the attention of St. Petersburg's elite. Invitations to private salons arrived, each letter carefully phrased, expressing polite curiosity, admiration, and cautious skepticism. These gatherings, often held in richly decorated parlors with heavy draperies and candlelit chandeliers, became the arenas where her reputation would take root. Attendees included members of the aristocracy, wealthy merchants, and occasional scholars intrigued by reports of her uncanny knowledge. The tension in these rooms was immediate and palpable. Guests arrived with polite amusement, expecting entertainment, and perhaps a clever trick, only to find themselves confronted with insights that unsettled even the most composed individuals. The first public demonstrations were met with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. Elizaveta spoke with calm certainty, recounting intimate details of lives she could not possibly know. A countess, initially skeptical, found herself unnerved as Elizaveta described her husband's clandestine financial dealings with astonishing accuracy. A visiting diplomat's personal anxieties were laid bare, the minutiae of his correspondence revealed in precise detail. The audience shifted in their seats, eyes wide, some leaning forward with curiosity, others recoiling slightly as an invisible weight seemed to press upon the room. Whispers began to circulate, and the initial polite amusement gave way to a deeper, almost fearful fascination. Stories of her demonstrations spread rapidly. Observers who had attended the first salons recounted events to friends and acquaintances, often embellishing the narrative in ways that heightened her mystique. One guest might claim that she had predicted a letter's arrival before it was posted, another that she had described a private family quarrel that had never been mentioned aloud. These tales traveled through the social network of the city like wildfire, drawing further audiences eager to witness her gift firsthand. Some came skeptically, certain they would expose a trick or coincidence, while others approached with reverence, convinced of a supernatural element beyond human understanding. The psychological impact on witnesses was profound. Even those inclined toward rational explanations felt the unease of encountering knowledge that seemed to transcend ordinary means. Social facades began to crumble, revealing the vulnerabilities and secrets of the privileged. Guests whispered anxiously to one another, questioning what they had seen and heard, and whether they could trust their own perception. In this context, Elizaveta became not merely a source of curiosity but a mirror reflecting hidden truths, insecurities, and the shadowed recesses of personal and collective consciousness. The salons transformed from spaces of leisurely amusement to arenas of subtle psychological tension, where the normal rules of social interaction and certainty no longer fully applied. Some accounts describe moments when Elizaveta's pronouncements went beyond mere observation. She predicted accidents and minor tragedies with a precision that left attendees shaken. A carriage accident predicted in advance would occur almost exactly as she had described. A delayed delivery arrived hours later in the precise sequence she had mentioned. While some dismissed these as fortunate coincidences, the cumulative weight of repeated accuracy created an undeniable pattern. Guests began to measure her words carefully, watching reactions, testing her knowledge, and probing for flaws, yet each attempt to expose her only seemed to reinforce the eerie credibility of her insights. The salons also became venues for subtle tension between curiosity and fear. Families hesitated to disclose sensitive information, aware that she might reveal what they wished to conceal. Conversations were punctuated by anxious glances, hushed warnings, and the occasional uncomfortable laughter attempting to mask growing unease. Servants and staff often noted the palpable atmosphere of anticipation that clung to the rooms, the way conversations seemed to quiet when she entered, and the unspoken understanding that ordinary decorum had been supplanted by an awareness of extraordinary knowledge. The city's fascination with her gift was matched by the quiet, creeping fear it elicited in those who had glimpsed the depths of her insight. Elizaveta herself navigated these public appearances with a combination of grace, humility, and calm authority. She did not flaunt her abilities, nor did she boast of supernatural powers. Instead, she spoke with the matter-of-fact tone of someone recounting memory, as if the events and details she described were already set in the world and merely awaiting recognition. This deliberate restraint enhanced the impact of her words, leaving witnesses to grapple with the uncanny certainty of her statements. Some described feeling as if she could see directly into their thoughts, intuitions, and secrets, an intimacy both fascinating and unnerving. As the story of her abilities grew, so did the diversity of those who came to observe her. Scientists, philosophers, journalists, and ordinary citizens alike sought verification, explanation, or simply the thrill of witnessing the extraordinary. Each encounter layered additional complexity onto her public persona. Some hailed her as a prodigy of perception, others whispered of darker forces, and many wrestled with conflicting emotions of awe, envy, fear, and curiosity. Social networks buzzed with speculation, letters and diaries documented astonishment and trepidation, and the narrative of Elizaveta's life began to extend beyond the salons into the broader consciousness of St. Petersburg society. By the time she had appeared in multiple salons, the city was awash with stories of the medium who could speak of the lives of strangers as if they were her own memories. People debated the nature of her gift with intensity, weighing probability against impossibility, logic against intuition, and rationality against the undeniable accuracy of her statements. The whispers in the salons became a persistent hum in the streets, a cultural undercurrent that both celebrated and feared the presence of someone who had pierced the veil of ordinary perception. The stage was set for a confrontation between fascination and suspicion, belief and denial, that would shape the next chapters of her life. As word of Elizaveta's abilities spread through the salons and drawing rooms of St. Petersburg, it inevitably reached the ears of the Orthodox Church, whose representatives viewed such displays with suspicion, concern, and a hint of fear. The Church had long maintained a tenuous authority over matters of belief, morality, and the spiritual welfare of the populace, and a young woman speaking with uncanny knowledge of strangers' lives was perceived as a potential threat. Clergy debated privately whether her abilities were a genuine spiritual gift, a deception, or even a sign of demonic influence. The tension between religious authority and public fascination grew as her reputation swelled, framing her story within a broader conflict of faith, power, and the unknown. Priests and church officials began to intervene discreetly at first, attending salons to observe her demonstrations, questioning her methods and intentions. Their presence introduced a new form of pressure, a moral scrutiny that contrasted sharply with the social curiosity of the elite. Elizaveta, calm and composed, answered questions honestly, neither claiming divine inspiration nor denying her ability. Yet the very act of inquiry suggested a threat. Rumors circulated that some clergy feared she could sway the faithful, drawing attention away from religious instruction and encouraging interest in mystical practices outside sanctioned doctrine. Socially, her audiences became more tense, aware that the Church's watchful eyes could scrutinize every word, every gesture, every revelation she made. Public reactions reflected a society caught between reverence and fear. Among devout citizens, whispers grew that her powers were unnatural, potentially dangerous, or heretical. Families debated whether attending her séances was morally acceptable, weighing the thrill of witnessing the uncanny against the possibility of spiritual corruption. The salons, once spaces of social entertainment and intellectual curiosity, became arenas of moral judgment, where the act of listening to her was itself a test of conscience. People tiptoed between fascination and fear, increasingly aware that participating in her demonstrations might carry consequences beyond the ordinary. The Church's interventions escalated over time. Official warnings were issued to the elite, urging caution and denouncing excessive attention to such phenomena. Clerics visited patrons and householders privately, instructing them on the dangers of indulging in practices that blurred the line between the divine and the profane. Some even attempted to restrict her movements or discourage her from appearing publicly, framing the warnings as acts of moral guidance. In response, the aristocracy found themselves navigating a delicate balance. They were drawn to her gift, yet wary of ecclesiastical censure. The tension heightened the stakes of every gathering, with each salon now layered with social, spiritual, and psychological pressure. Elizaveta herself faced an increasingly heavy burden. The warnings, coupled with growing public scrutiny, weighed on her psyche. She became acutely aware that her abilities, once a private phenomenon, were now scrutinized not only for curiosity but also for perceived moral implications. Nights grew restless, filled with dreams and visions that reflected both her empathy and her growing anxiety. Each revelation carried emotional weight. She began to sense the fear and moral judgment of others, which deepened her own apprehension. The atmosphere in her life shifted, blending fascination, dread, and the moral ambiguity imposed by religious oversight. The conflict between faith and phenomena became a subtle social drama, played out not just in sermons and letters, but in whispered conversations at dinners and behind closed doors. Families who had once invited her with eager curiosity now hesitated, questioning the propriety of witnessing her abilities. Some guests left early, uncomfortable with the idea of associating with someone whom clergy had subtly warned against. Others attended with a sense of defiance, testing the boundaries of faith and reason, thrill and fear. This complex interplay of social dynamics intensified the suspense surrounding her story, as public perception oscillated between admiration and condemnation. At the same time, there were those within the Church who saw her gift as potentially divine. A few individuals quietly speculated that she might be an instrument of providence, capable of delivering insight to the faithful or guiding moral decisions. These voices, however, were muted, often overshadowed by the dominant narrative of suspicion and caution. The contrast between those who feared her and those who cautiously supported her deepened the sense of moral ambiguity in the city, reflecting broader societal tensions between reason, faith, and curiosity. Elizaveta's interactions with clergy also illuminated the psychological strain of navigating public scrutiny. She maintained a composed exterior, but internally she wrestled with questions of responsibility, purpose, and consequence. Each gathering required careful calibration: how much to reveal, what to withhold, and how to speak truth without causing undue alarm. The weight of judgment, combined with her extraordinary awareness of the lives she touched, created a tension that seeped into every aspect of her behavior. Friends and patrons observed subtle changes, moments of hesitation, quiet reflection, and a growing sense of melancholy that shadowed her presence. Socially, the Church's intervention created an atmosphere of clandestine fascination. Those intrigued by her abilities were simultaneously cautious, aware of the risks of public association. Letters, diaries, and private accounts reveal a community both enthralled and apprehensive, balancing desire for knowledge against fear of moral or spiritual consequence. Conversations shifted from open curiosity to coded discussion, with patrons testing one another's beliefs and suspicions in hushed tones. This quiet tension amplified the allure of Elizaveta's gift, embedding her story within a network of secrecy, moral reflection, and growing societal intrigue. By the conclusion of this period, the dynamic between Elizaveta, her audience, and the Church had established a complex pattern of fascination, fear, and moral negotiation. Her abilities could no longer be considered purely social entertainment or personal peculiarity; they had become a moral and spiritual puzzle that touched the city's elite, clergy, and wider society. The salons, once mere stages for observation, had evolved into microcosms of societal tension, where curiosity collided with conscience, and where the very act of witnessing the extraordinary became fraught with ethical and spiritual consequence. The stage was set for further escalation, both in the intensity of her revelations and in the psychological and social pressures that would define her public life. As Elizaveta's gift became increasingly undeniable, the intensity of her experiences, and the pressure of public attention, began to take a profound toll on her psyche. What had once been a private curiosity evolved into a relentless force that dominated her waking thoughts and haunted her nights. She could no longer retreat into the quiet comfort of family life without being reminded of the broader implications of her abilities. Dreams and waking visions intertwined, often with terrifying clarity, depicting strangers' futures in vivid detail, from minor accidents to personal tragedies, each event carrying emotional weight that pressed upon her conscience. The boundary between observation and experience began to blur, leaving her disoriented, exhausted, and deeply anxious. Her social circles noticed the change first. Friends and patrons who had previously admired her composure began to see subtle tremors in her voice, hesitant pauses, and moments of intense reflection that seemed out of proportion to ordinary conversation. She became withdrawn, her laughter rare and her attention consumed by the incessant flow of information she could not control. Conversations that once seemed effortless now required careful calculation, as she weighed the impact of each word on those around her. The salons that had celebrated her abilities became stages of scrutiny, where every revelation was met with awe, fear, or both, and where the weight of her audience's expectations pressed heavily upon her fragile composure. The psychological strain manifested in insomnia, restless pacing, and frequent headaches. Nights became a battleground for her mind, as she replayed visions of strangers' lives and future events, unable to escape the relentless procession of information. Even in sleep, she would murmur names, dates, and details, disturbing household members and leaving herself increasingly fatigued. The emotional burden of witnessing tragedies and privacies not meant for her eyes began to compound. She felt a growing responsibility for the lives she observed, a moral and ethical weight that compounded her isolation. Every prediction, every revelation became a source of anxiety, leaving her trapped in a cycle of empathy, dread, and an inescapable sense of duty. Meanwhile, the reactions of society only intensified her stress. Audiences oscillated between admiration and skepticism, creating an unpredictable social environment. Some visitors arrived with curiosity, seeking entertainment, only to leave unsettled or frightened, their disbelief slowly giving way to a grudging acceptance of her abilities. Others approached her with reverence, almost worshipfully, projecting onto her the hopes and fears of an anxious city. The fluctuating responses reinforced her isolation. She could never be entirely herself, always performing a delicate balance between transparency and concealment, authenticity and self-preservation. The weight of public scrutiny, combined with the relentless influx of knowledge, began to erode her sense of normalcy. Simple routines, meals, walks, correspondence, became challenges, as she wrestled with unbidden recollections of strangers' secrets and futures. Each casual encounter risked triggering new insights, compelling her to act, speak, or withhold information. Friends noted her growing irritability and sudden, inexplicable melancholy. Patrons observed that her once fluid presence had become taut, her movements deliberate and cautious, her expressions weighted by the constant awareness of the unseen. The strain was both social and internal, a psychological pressure cooker fueled by the unrelenting demands of perception and expectation. Her visions themselves grew darker and more complex. She began to foresee accidents, losses, and emotional turmoil with such precision that she often anticipated not only events but the emotional responses of those involved. This heightened sensitivity made ordinary social interactions fraught with tension. She would foresee arguments, misunderstandings, or distress, and the knowledge of these impending events made her hesitant, sometimes to the point of withdrawal. Even trivial interactions became tests of restraint, as revealing too much or too little could profoundly affect those around her. The cumulative weight of seeing the future in such granular detail left her vulnerable to despair, frustration, and a pervasive sense of helplessness. Attempts by friends and family to alleviate her burden were limited in effect. They encouraged her to rest, engage in leisure, and participate in ordinary social activities, yet the very nature of her gift prevented complete reprieve. Even moments of solitude were invaded by visions, and the ongoing public interest ensured that she remained psychologically tethered to the expectations and fears of others. Her emotional landscape became increasingly complex, a tension-filled mixture of empathy, exhaustion, fear, and awe. Those who loved her could only watch, powerless to intervene, as her gift demanded constant engagement, vigilance, and moral navigation. The salons themselves reflected this escalation. Audiences became more attentive, less indulgent, and more demanding, often testing her with questions, challenges, and attempts to provoke errors. Every session became a psychological trial, a space where she had to navigate not only her own fatigue and anxiety but also the skepticism, expectations, and moral judgments of her spectators. The social spotlight was relentless, leaving little room for recovery or respite. Her gift, once a source of curiosity and admiration, became both a burden and a trap, drawing her further into isolation even as it drew others closer in fascination. By this stage, the interplay between her extraordinary abilities and human vulnerability was unmistakable. Elizaveta was no longer simply a performer of remarkable insights, she had become a figure defined by tension, contradiction, and a weight of knowledge she could neither fully explain nor fully control. Her life oscillated between public demonstration and private torment, between fascination and dread, creating a slow-burning suspense that mirrored the growing anxiety of the city around her. The psychological and social pressures converged to form a crucible in which her humanity and her gift were inseparable, each amplifying the other in a subtle, emotionally resonant drama that gripped both her and those who witnessed her. As Elizaveta's reputation grew, a number of scientists, physicians, and occult investigators became intrigued by the reports of her abilities, determined to subject them to scrutiny. They approached her with a combination of curiosity, skepticism, and, in some cases, outright incredulity. Sessions were arranged under controlled circumstances, with observers attempting to test her knowledge through careful questioning, note-taking, and experimental methods. Each meeting was meticulously documented, often in the form of letters, diaries, or formal reports. Yet despite their rigorous attempts to dissect her gift, no conclusive explanation emerged. The experts, trained to rely on evidence and observation, found themselves confounded by results that appeared consistently precise yet defied conventional logic. Medical professionals conducted examinations designed to detect neurological or psychological anomalies. They observed her during waking and sleeping hours, recorded her reactions to stimuli, and tested her memory and recall in numerous ways. Psychologists attempted to determine whether her insights could be explained by acute observation, eidetic memory, or subconscious inference. Yet the accuracy of her revelations, especially regarding individuals she had never met or events that had yet to occur, consistently exceeded the bounds of these theories. Reports noted a pattern: she provided highly specific, verifiable details that could not be attributed to chance, hearsay, or deduction, leaving the investigators with a sense of both astonishment and unease. Some scholars approached her from a metaphysical perspective. Members of occult societies and spiritualist circles observed her with interest, attempting to understand whether her abilities were connected to the energies, spirits, or hidden forces they believed permeated the world. Seances were organized, often with the presence of witnesses from both scientific and social circles, blending ritual, observation, and inquiry. Yet even within these mystical frameworks, Elizaveta's gift resisted classification. She did not summon spirits, read cards, or employ traditional tools of divination, rather, she appeared to access information directly, with an uncanny certainty that blurred the line between intuition and knowledge. Her abilities remained consistent, precise, and unexplainable, challenging both the rational and the esoteric paradigms. Journalists also became involved, hoping to document her phenomenon for the wider public. They recorded interviews, attempted to stage scenarios, and circulated accounts of her predictions. Each report added layers to her growing legend, yet the factual documentation repeatedly reinforced the sense of accuracy and reliability that made her more than a mere sensationalist curiosity. Some skeptics sought to expose her as a fraud, creating situations designed to trick or confuse her. While occasional minor errors occurred, these were rare and could often be explained by ambiguity or miscommunication rather than deliberate deception. In the aggregate, her precision remained striking, leaving critics with a growing acknowledgement of the inexplicable nature of her gift. The attempts to rationalize her abilities often highlighted the limits of contemporary understanding. Scientists and philosophers debated whether she might possess extraordinary memory, hyperobservation, or an unknown cognitive faculty. Others speculated about clairvoyance, psychic sensitivity, or precognition, though these explanations were typically framed as controversial and unverified. Each hypothesis, whether grounded in reason or metaphysics, failed to capture the full scope of her insight. Observers documented the pattern. Elizaveta consistently demonstrated knowledge that spanned time and space, connecting people, events, and details in ways that eluded conventional comprehension. The social dynamics surrounding these examinations added additional tension. Patrons, clergy, and curious citizens sometimes attended, their presence influencing her demeanor and the atmosphere of scrutiny. The salons transformed into spaces of both observation and judgment, where her every word and gesture was analyzed. The interplay between public attention and scientific examination intensified her psychological burden. Friends and family watched as she navigated the complex expectations, careful not to reveal too much, yet compelled by the unstoppable flow of information she could access. Each session reinforced the sense that she existed in a liminal space between ordinary humanity and something beyond comprehension. Despite the scrutiny, her gift persisted, unyielding and consistent. Investigators often left sessions frustrated, unable to reconcile their methods with the results. The more they attempted to constrain, test, or explain her, the more evident it became that Elizaveta's abilities could not be reduced to conventional frameworks. She operated outside established paradigms, leaving both the rational mind and a mystical imagination searching for explanations that could not fully account for the phenomenon before them. In this space, fascination coexisted with fear, respect mingled with doubt, and the air of mystery thickened around her presence. The attempts at rational explanation, though ultimately inconclusive, had profound implications. They solidified her reputation as a phenomenon beyond ordinary understanding, elevating her from a curious social novelty to a figure whose very existence challenged assumptions about knowledge, perception, and the limits of human cognition. The city's elite and learned classes alike were forced to acknowledge, however reluctantly, that there existed a young woman whose insights defied classification, whose gift resisted rational analysis, and whose presence created a profound, lingering tension between reason, belief, and the extraordinary. By the end of this period, Elizaveta had become both a subject of intense study and a mirror reflecting the limitations of contemporary knowledge. Every observation, test, and inquiry only underscored the profound mystery she embodied. In the process, she highlighted not only the strangeness of her own abilities but also the fragility of human certainty. What could not be explained by reason, logic, or ritual became a space for wonder, fear, and speculation, setting the stage for the isolation and psychological pressures that would dominate the next chapters of her story. The growing weight of Elizaveta's abilities, combined with the relentless public attention and the mounting scrutiny from both scientists and clergy, began to push her into a state of isolation. What had once been a series of controlled demonstrations now became a constant, inescapable reality. She could no longer step into a room without the awareness that someone's life, secret, or future might present itself to her consciousness. Every social interaction carried the risk of revelation, every casual observation potentially transformed into knowledge she was compelled to share. This relentless demand, both internal and external, began to erode her sense of normalcy, leaving her increasingly withdrawn and cautious. The salons and drawing rooms where she had once been celebrated transformed into spaces of tension. Patrons who arrived with polite curiosity now approached with anxiety and expectation, aware that her insights could touch their most private matters. Friends and family observed subtle changes in her demeanor, hesitancy in speech, long periods of silent reflection, and a tendency to avoid prolonged social contact. Her laughter, once light and spontaneous, became rare, replaced by a quiet composure that seemed constantly measured against the unrelenting flow of her knowledge. The psychological strain of holding intimate insights about multiple lives simultaneously created a pervasive fatigue, leaving her body and mind in a constant state of vigilance. Isolation extended beyond social spaces into her private life. Even within the walls of her family home, she could not escape the unbidden visions that surfaced at any moment. Meals were eaten in contemplative silence, walks were undertaken with measured steps, and ordinary conversations became exercises in control, filtering what she revealed and what she withheld. Her parents, once confident in their ability to guide and protect her, increasingly watched helplessly as their daughter navigated an existence defined by knowledge she neither sought nor could fully manage. The boundaries between public performance, private life, and moral responsibility blurred, creating a profound sense of loneliness and alienation. The emotional toll was compounded by the intensity of the events she foresaw. Unlike casual observations, many visions were distressing. Accidents, betrayals, illnesses, and personal tragedies unfolded in her consciousness before they occurred in reality. She carried the weight of these foreseen events, often experiencing them emotionally as if they had already happened. This constant empathy left her exhausted and psychologically strained, and her sense of responsibility deepened. She felt compelled to warn or guide, yet understood that any intervention could have unpredictable consequences. The tension between action and restraint became a central, inescapable conflict, shaping her interactions and her mental state. Even minor mistakes or ambiguities in her revelations became sources of anxiety. Patrons and witnesses scrutinized her every word, and the possibility of error, however slight, weighed heavily on her conscience. She developed meticulous habits, rehearsing phrases mentally, preparing for interactions, and constantly assessing the potential impact of her knowledge. This hypervigilance, while necessary for her public appearances, reinforced a growing sense of isolation. She could never fully relax, never fully inhabit the ordinary life of her peers, because her consciousness was continually occupied with the lives, secrets, and futures of others. The city itself contributed to the pervasive sense of isolation. St. Petersburg's winter fog, darkened streets, and dimly lit salons mirrored her internal state. The grandeur of the city's architecture, once a backdrop for social performance, became a reminder of the distance between her and those around her. The Neva River, its surface dark and reflective, seemed to echo the duality of her existence, beauty and dread intertwined, reality and foreknowledge layered atop one another. Her walk along the embankments at dusk became both a respite and a reminder of the unrelenting pressures she faced, the quiet streets amplifying her sense of being separate from the ordinary rhythms of life. Social dynamics added another layer to her isolation. Friends, once eager to support and celebrate her, now approached cautiously, uncertain how to interact with someone who knew too much. Patrons and onlookers vacillated between reverence and fear, creating an atmosphere in which ordinary social engagement became fraught with tension. Even attempts at casual conversation risked touching upon secrets or foreseen events, placing her in a position where withdrawal often felt safer than participation. The cycle of engagement and retreat intensified, reinforcing both the social and psychological isolation that defined this period of her life. Elizaveta's own sense of identity shifted in response to these pressures. She increasingly saw herself through the lens of her gift, as though her value and purpose were inseparable from the knowledge she carried. Moments of personal desire or whimsy were frequently overshadowed by the unbidden intrusion of someone else's future. This persistent engagement with lives beyond her own created a sense of alienation, as if her consciousness were constantly divided, unable to fully inhabit the ordinary experiences of youth, family, or friendship. She existed in a liminal space, simultaneously present and removed, observer and participant, burdened by knowledge and compelled by empathy. By the end of this period, Elizaveta's life had become defined by the intersection of extraordinary insight and profound isolation. Her gift, once a source of fascination and admiration, had evolved into a constant, inescapable responsibility that permeated every interaction, thought, and action. Social, psychological, and moral pressures converged, leaving her in a state of heightened awareness, persistent anxiety, and careful withdrawal. The salons, streets, and private spaces of St. Petersburg were no longer simply settings for her life, they had become extensions of the tension, anticipation, and emotional weight she carried, setting the stage for the eventual collapse, estrangement, and emotional climax that would define the next chapters of her story. The aftermath of Elizaveta's public presence left a lingering tension that seeped into every corner of St. Petersburg society. The salons, once vibrant with curiosity and social chatter, became quieter spaces, punctuated by hushed conversations about the medium who had unsettled so many lives with her uncanny foresight. Patrons and witnesses carried the weight of what they had observed, their private thoughts colored by anticipation, anxiety, and the residual awe that accompanied her demonstrations. Even weeks after her appearances, families found themselves discussing her predictions in quiet, careful tones, debating whether they had been coincidence, manipulation, or a genuine glimpse into the unknown. Local gossip amplified the sense of mystery and unease. Letters passed discreetly among social circles, recounting minute details of her foresight with embellishments that grew more elaborate with each retelling. Anecdotes of events she had predicted circulated alongside speculation about her methods, motivations, and potential sources of knowledge. Some accounts suggested divine inspiration, while others whispered of darker, more sinister forces at work. The city's elite, who had once sought entertainment in her presence, now approached the topic with caution, aware that their own reputation and moral standing might be implicated by association. Social gatherings included veiled references to her abilities, and even casual remarks were laden with tension, as though the memory of her insights had quietly reshaped the rules of interaction. Her family, once at the center of her private life, experienced the residual effects of her exposure. Their home, which had been a place of relative control and intimacy, now felt infiltrated by the public consciousness. Visitors arrived at unexpected times, eager to verify rumors or seek personal insight. Even those who were sympathetic could not entirely ease the psychological burden that accompanied the attention. The family's sense of normalcy eroded, replaced by an awareness that the boundaries between private and public life had irrevocably shifted. They witnessed Elizaveta grappling with a tension between the desire for solitude and the inexorable pull of her social obligations, a balance that grew increasingly untenable with each passing day. The psychological residue of her demonstrations was perhaps most profound among those who had attended multiple sessions. Witnesses reported recurring dreams and inexplicable recollections, moments in which her words and predictions returned unbidden to consciousness. Some found themselves hesitant to act on certain decisions, haunted by her foresight and the uncanny precision with which she had described events. Social anxiety, self-doubt, and a heightened sense of observation became common, as if the very act of encountering her had subtly shifted their perception of time, causality, and human behavior. The city, in microcosm, had absorbed a collective tension that persisted long after her presence was physically absent. Attempts to rationalize the experience were widespread but largely inconclusive. Clergy, still cautious and occasionally critical, continued to debate the implications of her abilities, framing discussions in terms of morality, divine influence, and spiritual propriety. Scientific observers documented their methods and findings meticulously, yet even the most rigorous analyses could not account for the accuracy and consistency of her predictions. The coexistence of faith, reason, and anecdotal observation created an unresolved tension, leaving the public in a state of wonder, suspicion, and unease. The unresolved nature of these inquiries contributed to a sense of open-ended mystery, ensuring that her story lingered in social consciousness long after her direct interactions had ended. The city itself seemed to absorb her absence as a presence. Streets walked by her former audiences felt subtly altered, as if the memory of her insight had left a trace in the rhythm of daily life. Conversations in cafes and salons often returned to hypothetical scenarios: what would she have said, or could she have foreseen this? These unspoken questions fostered a climate of reflection and unease, embedding her story into the social fabric of St. Petersburg. Ordinary events became tinted with the possibility of premonition, minor coincidences were interpreted as echoes of her insight, and the collective imagination of the city was subtly reshaped. For Elizaveta herself, the aftermath was a complicated mixture of relief, fatigue, and continuing psychological strain. Freed temporarily from the immediate demands of public scrutiny, she found space to reflect, yet the experiences remained vividly imprinted in her consciousness. The moral and emotional responsibility she had carried did not dissipate, instead, it transformed into a quiet, internalized awareness of the consequences her knowledge could have on others. Even in private moments, she felt the lingering presence of the city's attention, the memory of faces, voices, and events she had described with such precision. The boundaries between past and future, observer and participant, continued to blur, sustaining a subtle but persistent tension in her daily existence. Amid the quiet and reflection, stories of her gift evolved into legend. Families recounted experiences to the next generation, embellishing details, interpreting events in new ways, and passing along a narrative that became part cautionary tale, part social lore. Newspapers, journals, and personal diaries preserved fragments of her demonstrations, ensuring that her influence extended beyond immediate witnesses. The city's memory of her actions was as much a psychological and cultural imprint as a factual record, shaping perceptions of fate, knowledge, and the uncanny. Even those who had not encountered her directly came to know of her abilities through these layered accounts, amplifying the sense of mystery and the persistent question of how such knowledge was possible. By the end of this period, the city of St. Petersburg, and those intimately connected to Elizaveta, were caught between acknowledgement and denial. The residual effects of her presence created an atmosphere where ordinary reality seemed temporarily suspended, morality and curiosity interwoven, and the unexplained became a subject of ongoing reflection. Her absence in physical form did not diminish the psychological and social impact she had exerted. Instead, it ensured that her influence persisted as a haunting and unresolved element of the city's collective consciousness, setting the stage for final theories, speculation, and the lingering questions that would define her legacy. Speculation regarding Elizaveta's abilities intensified in the years following her most prominent public demonstrations, as writers, scientists, spiritualists, and ordinary citizens alike attempted to unravel the enigma she represented. The city of St. Petersburg became a nexus of debate, where reason, folklore, and fear intersected in discussions that spanned drawing rooms, cafes, and academic societies. Some posited that she possessed a form of hyperobservation or eidetic memory so advanced that it transcended the known boundaries of cognition. Others insisted she had access to some hidden spiritual plane, a conduit through which knowledge of the future and the private lives of strangers flowed unimpeded. Every theory, however, encountered limitations, leaving room for doubt and persistent wonder. Scientific and medical communities attempted to establish frameworks to explain her abilities. Psychologists studied her patterns of recall, testing whether subtle cues, facial expressions, or social signals could account for her insights. Neurologists considered the possibility of heightened perception or synesthetic connections that allowed her to link information in unprecedented ways. Each investigation, while rigorous, ultimately fell short of a conclusive explanation. In documented sessions, her predictions exceeded what could reasonably be explained by chance or deduction, especially in cases involving strangers, distant events, or outcomes that were not influenced by observable behavior. Reports from these examinations were often meticulous, noting the exact phrasing of her statements, the reactions of witnesses, and the verification of subsequent events. The detailed records provided evidence of consistency, but the mechanism remained elusive. Simultaneously, spiritualist and occult circles offered alternative interpretations, framing her as a seer or medium connected to forces beyond human comprehension. Seances, guided meditations, and attempts to channel her abilities were organized, blending ritual, inquiry, and observation. In these settings, her gift resisted traditional classification. She did not rely on divination tools, invocation, or intermediaries. Instead, knowledge appeared to emerge directly from her consciousness with extraordinary clarity and precision. Observers described the experience as both humbling and disquieting, noting the emotional weight of her insights and the unsettling intimacy with which she seemed to access others' lives. These interpretations added layers of spiritual significance to her story, creating a dual narrative of scientific curiosity and mystical intrigue. Writers and journalists contributed to the public mythos surrounding Elizaveta, producing accounts that alternated between skepticism and fascination. Some narratives emphasized the rational impossibility of her accuracy, while others highlighted the ethical and moral dimensions of possessing such insight. Stories circulated that blurred the line between fact and folklore. Letters and diaries recorded not only what she had predicted but also the psychological effects on witnesses. Anxiety, awe, fear, and moral contemplation became recurring themes, suggesting that her influence extended beyond knowledge into the social and emotional consciousness of the city. These accounts reinforced her legend, cementing her presence in the collective imagination even as the tangible details of her daily life faded from public view. One particularly striking element of Elizaveta's legacy was the ethical questions her abilities raised. Those who witnessed her insights often found themselves grappling with the implications of foreknowledge, privacy, and moral responsibility. If someone's future could be glimpsed with accuracy, what obligations did that knowledge impose on the observer? Should warnings be issued, and if so, to what extent could intervention alter the course of events? Her gift created a moral labyrinth, forcing both herself and her audience to navigate dilemmas that had no clear solutions. Letters and diaries from the period reveal prolonged debates over these questions, suggesting that the fascination with her abilities was inseparable from the psychological and ethical tensions they engendered. Her influence also extended into artistic and literary circles, where her story inspired reflections on fate, knowledge, and human limitation. Poets, novelists, and playwrights incorporated themes reminiscent of her experiences, characters who glimpsed hidden truths, the tension between foresight and moral action, and the isolation that accompanies extraordinary perception. In these interpretations, Elizaveta became more than a historical figure, she emerged as a symbol of human confrontation with the unknowable. Artists explored the paradox of someone simultaneously gifted and burdened, whose insights illuminated the private worlds of others while casting shadows over her own existence. Despite the enduring fascination, Elizaveta's personal life remained largely obscured. Scholars attempting to construct a biography faced fragmented accounts, with details of her domestic life, private thoughts, and emotional experiences recorded unevenly. The tension between her public visibility and private existence contributed to her mystique. She was present in the social imagination, yet inaccessible in intimate terms. This duality amplified the sense of wonder surrounding her abilities, highlighting both the possibilities and the limits of human understanding. Her legacy became a narrative not only of knowledge but also of separation, illustrating the emotional and social costs of extraordinary insight. The passage of time further complicated interpretation. Witnesses aged, memories shifted, and anecdotes acquired layers of embellishment. Nevertheless, patterns persisted, accounts consistently emphasized her precision, emotional resonance, and the subtle ethical tensions her insights produced. Scholars analyzing these records noted that the phenomena surrounding her were not merely isolated incidents but a sustained pattern of interaction between knowledge, perception, and social consequence. The enduring fascination reflected not only the uniqueness of her abilities but also the way her presence challenged conventional assumptions about human cognition, morality, and the boundaries between ordinary and extraordinary experience. In contemporary examinations, historians and psychologists alike have attempted to reconcile her story with known frameworks of memory, intuition, and social perception. Some suggest that her abilities might represent an extreme form of cognitive empathy or unconscious synthesis of environmental cues. Others contend that her insights point to phenomena that remain scientifically unexplained, hinting at the potential for human consciousness to access dimensions of experience beyond ordinary temporal and spatial boundaries. Across all interpretations, one theme remains constant: Elizaveta's presence left a permanent imprint, both socially and psychologically, marking her as a figure whose life and abilities continue to provoke wonder, speculation, and profound reflection. Ultimately, the final theories surrounding Elizaveta cannot be neatly categorized. She stands as a liminal figure between science and mysticism, observation and intuition, insight and psychological consequence. Her story exemplifies the tension between curiosity and fear, knowledge and responsibility, and the limits of human understanding. Even as decades have passed, the questions she posed, about perception, ethics, and the nature of knowledge, remain unresolved. Her legacy endures not only in historical accounts but also in the broader cultural imagination, symbolizing the enduring human fascination with the extraordinary and the unknowable. Elizaveta's legacy, by the time it reached the broader historical record, had become an intricate tapestry of fact, speculation, and enduring mystery. The extraordinary precision with which she had accessed the intimate details and futures of strangers continued to challenge interpretations long after her public appearances had ceased. Scholars, journalists, and witnesses alike struggled to reconcile her documented insights with conventional understanding, leaving a persistent tension between the known and the unknowable. For many, her story became emblematic of the limits of human perception and the profound implications of encountering knowledge beyond ordinary comprehension. Accounts from those who had interacted with her painted a consistent yet unsettling portrait. Patrons recalled the meticulous care with which she spoke, the uncanny ability to recall names, events, and emotions with such accuracy that disbelief often gave way to silent astonishment. Clergy who had initially approached her with suspicion were sometimes forced into reluctant acknowledgement of the phenomenon, even as they cautioned against attributing her abilities to divine favor or dismissed them as dangerous. Scientists and physicians documented their observations, recording attempts to test her memory, perception, and foresight, yet repeatedly encountered results that defied logical explanation. The coexistence of admiration, fear, skepticism, and awe became a defining feature of her influence. Her personal correspondence and diaries, though limited, reveal the human cost of her abilities. She described feelings of exhaustion, isolation, and a persistent anxiety born from the relentless influx of information about others' lives. Each insight carried a moral weight, the knowledge of a pending accident, a personal betrayal, or a family secret imposed upon her a responsibility she could neither delegate nor ignore. The very act of perceiving the future became a form of ethical engagement, forcing her to navigate dilemmas that had no clear solutions. Her reflections suggest a consciousness deeply attuned to the consequences of foresight, aware that each revelation could ripple through the lives of others, altering choices, behaviors, and relationships. Socially, the impact of her abilities persisted long after she withdrew from public demonstration. Families who had attended her sessions continued to discuss her predictions, parsing the accuracy of her insights and interpreting their own experiences in light of her foresight. The salons, once venues of curiosity and amusement, had catalyzed a broader cultural conversation about knowledge, morality, and the limits of human understanding. Even those who had not encountered her directly engaged with her story through letters, newspapers, and personal anecdotes, amplifying the reach of her influence across St. Petersburg and beyond. Her presence had created a social and psychological ripple effect, leaving a community collectively attuned to questions of precognition, ethics, and the permeability of personal boundaries. Historians and cultural scholars analyzing her life note that Elizaveta functioned as both a mirror and a lens. She reflected the private anxieties, secrets, and desires of those around her, while simultaneously magnifying the social, moral, and psychological tensions inherent in encounters with the extraordinary. Her ability to access and articulate the intimate details of strangers' lives created a paradoxical space. She was at once deeply connected to others and profoundly isolated, empathetically immersed yet personally estranged. This duality permeated accounts of her life, lending a psychological and philosophical depth to the narrative that transcended mere anecdote or sensationalism. Theoretical interpretations of her abilities remain diverse. Some propose that her gift was an extension of heightened observation and cognitive synthesis, a form of perception so acute that it verged on the preternatural. Others embraced metaphysical explanations, framing her as a medium or seer whose consciousness accessed unseen dimensions of reality. Both interpretations, however, struggled to account for the consistency, precision, and ethical resonance of her insights. The tension between scientific rationalism and mystical interpretation became a defining feature of her posthumous reputation, illustrating the difficulty of reconciling extraordinary human capacities with established epistemological frameworks. Her influence on contemporaneous literature and culture was equally significant. Writers, poets, and dramatists drew inspiration from the paradoxes her life embodied, the intersection of knowledge and isolation, foresight and responsibility, empathy and psychological burden. Characters modeled on her experiences populated fictional narratives, exploring the implications of extraordinary perception and the emotional and social consequences of possessing insight beyond the ordinary. Her story thus transcended biography, becoming a symbol of the liminal space between ordinary human experience and the extraordinary, a motif that resonated through multiple artistic and intellectual domains. The long-term societal effect of her demonstrations also underscores the subtle ways in which extraordinary phenomena shape collective consciousness. Reports of her abilities encouraged reflection on personal ethics, fate, and the boundaries of human knowledge. Individuals who had witnessed or heard of her predictions often engaged in self-scrutiny, contemplating how knowledge of future events might influence behavior, moral choices, and interpersonal relationships. Her influence extended beyond curiosity, prompting enduring philosophical and ethical contemplation, and fostering a cultural dialogue about the nature of perception, responsibility, and the unseen forces that shape human lives. Even the skepticism surrounding her remained a testament to her impact. Attempts to rationalize, debunk, or reduce her abilities to chance, memory, or manipulation repeatedly fell short. Critics acknowledged the consistency of her insights, yet struggled to account for them without invoking extraordinary explanations. This persistent uncertainty ensured that Elizavetta's story retained a sense of unresolved tension, one that continued to provoke inquiry, reflection, and debate across social, scientific, and cultural spheres. Her life became a case study not merely in human cognition or spiritual possibility but in the enduring power of mystery itself. By the final years of her life and in the decades that followed, Elizavetta's presence in historical records functioned as both narrative and symbol. She represented the intersection of empathy and foresight, moral responsibility and social perception, human limitation and extraordinary capacity. Accounts emphasize the weight of knowledge, the complexity of human relationships, and the psychological consequences of perceiving truths that others could neither see nor comprehend. Her story became a vehicle for exploring fundamental questions about human experience, the nature of time, consciousness, morality, and the unknown. Ultimately, the legacy of Elizaveta endures precisely because it resists resolution. Her abilities, meticulously documented yet incomprehensible, highlight the persistent tension between what is known and what remains beyond understanding. Her life exemplifies the psychological, social, and moral dimensions of extraordinary insight, revealing the ways in which knowledge can both illuminate and burden, connect and isolate. The city of St. Petersburg, its citizens, and all who later encountered her story remained haunted by the questions she embodied, the ethical dilemmas she posed, and the mysterious, enduring presence of a woman who could see the lives and futures of strangers with astonishing clarity and uncanny precision.